This is my assignment 4.3.3 on quantitative data collection. So quantitative data is data involving numerical data, so essentially involving numbers. It's objective, meaning that it isn't influenced by personal opinions or feelings. For example, I can measure numerical data on the performance of young Great British gymnasts on floor. So there are laboratory-based experiments. These are conducted in a laboratory to collect data. It's when an experiment is scientifically tested. For example, you could maybe measure the VO2 max of a young female gymnast in a lab by getting them to pedal on a bike and wear a face mask. And then this face mask will measure the volume of inspired and expired air, and it will provide numerical data on a computer. Advantages of this are it's a controlled environment. This could reduce any extraneous variables, which are variables which could potentially affect the results. Not ones that are supposed to be in the experiment. It can also allow for measuring of the specific variable you're testing. It has high internal validity, so essentially the experiment is accurately testing what it's supposed to test. And the disadvantages are that it's not a natural environment. So for example, for a gymnast to be doing an experiment in a laboratory is unnatural to them. They may not feel particularly comfortable with this, and this could affect the results. The equipment is very expensive, and also the training to use the equipment is expensive. And lastly, social desirability. So the gymnasts may want to impress the people working in the laboratory, for example, and this could also affect the results. There are field-based experiments in contrast. So this is when experiments are conducted in a natural environment to collect data. For example, I could measure the VO2 max of the young female Great British gymnast by completing a yo-yo test in their gymnastics club. So in this instance, data is collected in an environment that mimics the performance environment. So this is in the environment that the gymnasts are used to working in, so they'll be much more comfortable with this. Also, it increases ecological validity because these experiments are conducted in a natural environment in the real world. They're much cheaper and more accessible. However, disadvantages are that it's difficult to control confounding variables, which are variables which do affect the results, which aren't supposed to be in the experiment. So this lowers the internal validity because the experiment isn't necessarily accurately testing what it's supposed to. And there's also less repeatability because the confounding variables could essentially affect results significantly. And the equipment's far less sophisticated, so it might not be quite as useful in collecting data, and it may be a lot more time consuming as well than a laboratory-based experiment. Also, you can collect quantitative data using questionnaires. So a questionnaire is a set of written questions with a choice of answers for a statistical study. For example, I could devise a questionnaire for young female Great British gymnasts all about their sport, with options of strongly agreed, strongly disagree, agreed, disagree, or neither agree or disagree, to answer each question. So from this I could collect numerical data, see how many people had certain answers to certain questions. And ethical issues with questionnaires are privacy and consent. So a consent must be given from the gymnasts before they complete the questionnaire. It must be kept confidential, so only the data can be seen by the person who created the questionnaire. And yeah, so it must be protected, and there must also be debriefing and support. So advantages and disadvantages of questionnaires are they're simple. So if they're well designed, then it's easy to analyse quantitative data. There's less interpersonal influence, so the researcher isn't present, so there's less participant bias, so there won't be any pressure from the researcher when the participant is trying to complete the questionnaire. And it can also be anonymous. So if people don't want to reveal their identity about their certain views, they can just remain anonymous, so no one will know that the certain person has said that. Disadvantages, again, social desirability. They might want to appear a certain way to the public, and if they have a poor design, it obtains poor data. The questions, it's very important that whoever creates the questionnaire is skilled and knows how to create good questionnaires. And there's also wording issues. So some people who complete the questionnaires might kind of take certain wording differently and get a different idea from it and answer questions in a different way because of this. And moving on to observations. So this is when behaviours are observed and recorded. There's no manipulation of any variables, so it's the opposite of a true experiment, which is because in a true experiment there are variables which are manipulated, which is the independent variable, to then see what effect this has on the dependent variable, which is the thing that you measure. And in quantitative observations, something called event sampling is used. This is the observation of specific behaviours, so it's used to identify how many times a specific event occurs, and each time it does, it's noted with, for example, a tally or a tick. So, for example, I could do event sampling on young female Great British gymnasts and take note of each time a gymnast falls off of the beam when completing balance beam. And this then gives me numerical data on this situation. And advantages of this are it's immediate, so it's in the moment. You can form detailed notes from it. It's far less intrusive than an interview, because sometimes in interviews very personal questions can be asked, and this may not really appeal to the interviewee. Whereas in observation, you're simply just watching a group, and they don't feel like they're being pressured as much as they would in an interview. Disadvantages are it's easy to miss some behaviours. For example, if you're not using video analysis and simply just watching in the moment, it will be very difficult to observe everything that happens in a period of time. Also, there's the observer effect. So the presence of the observer could affect the behaviours of the participants. So it could be argued that it may not actually be natural, because if the participants know that the observer is there, they might then perform differently to how they would normally. And it's also time consuming. If you do use video analysis, then it will be very time consuming to analyse everything that occurred within the video. So this is another disadvantage of observations. Moving on, so there are a number of different experiment designs. So firstly, there are repeated measures. So this is when the same participants are used in each condition. For example, a group of young female Great British gymnasts could complete a sit and reach test wearing shorts and then wearing jeans. So this is the independent variable, because they're wearing different types of clothing. And the results will be collected from each type of clothing. So this is the dependent variable. This is what's being measured. Then there's independent groups. This is when completely unrelated groups are used in each condition. The group of young female Great British gymnasts could complete a sit and reach test wearing shorts and then wearing jeans. And then, for example, middle-aged obese participants could do the same, and then the results would be collected from both groups. So this is probably not the most reliable form of experiment design, because these participants are completely unrelated, and it's quite likely there's going to be a lot of variation in their results, because it's quite easy to guess that the young female Great British gymnasts are clearly going to get the best results, and they're going to be significantly higher than those of the middle-aged obese participants. So this is probably not the most reliable form of experiment design. There are matched pairs. So this is when, in contrast, this time, the groups of participants are carefully compared on all variables that are considered as relevant to the experiment. So, for example, sit and reach tests could be conducted by under 16 female Great British gymnasts wearing shorts and then wearing jeans. And then under 16 female Great British tennis players could do the same, and then the results are measured and collected. So both these sports, so they're the same age, they're both female, both national standard, and both sports are highly linked to flexibility. So this is these two groups are very, very matched, and all variables linked to the experiment are matched. So this time the results are likely to be a lot more repeatable between the two different groups. So this is a much more reliable experiment design. And lastly, there is also the crossover design. So this is when both groups conduct the same experiment with the same interventions, but they do them in the opposite order. So you can see here from this image on this slide, the first group do one intervention, whereas the other group do the second intervention, and then vice versa. So they swap interventions, but you can see they do them in different orders to each other. And this could actually reduce the validity of the results, because both the groups could do, I don't know, maybe they could do better on their second attempt at the sit and reach test, simply because they're more familiar with the sit and reach test after the first one. So regardless of what they're wearing each time, they might do better on their second one, just because they've got a better understanding of how to complete the test from their first attempt. And this could reduce the validity of the results, because the independent variable in the experiment isn't actually affecting the dependent variable. So yeah, that was my assignment 4.3.3.